Back, and thanks for joining me. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. Today's project is we are going to fix the low range problem in a new process 208 out of a full-size Jeep truck. The low range problem is it's in low range and no other gears, high range at all. So I'm thinking it probably has a range shifter problem or something like that. I'll show you once we get it all apart. So I started by taking the tail housing off, then start disassembling the gears and sprockets and chain. Got the case down to this point so I could start doing some diagnostics. The main shaft, which is good. The input shaft, which is also good. The planetary shifter are junk. You can see this big washer here, and the bushing is missing. But when you slide this shift fork in there, you can see where that has been grinding on it instead of the bushing, because the bushing's gone. Now to finish tearing down the case and the front output shaft assembly, then I'm going to flip it over and I will pull out the shift mechanism. Here you can see the shift mechanism. You have to unbolt the lever from the other side and then you can pull it straight out. Now when you pull that out, make sure you don't lose this little piece. It's called the detent for the shifter. On the other side of the case, it's a little easier to see. You can see here where my pick is. That's where the detent goes. And then this larger hole is where the shifter is. And you just push the O-ring out or pull it out from the outside, either way. But there's a nylon retainer there. Pull that retainer and then the O-ring comes right out. There you go. Next, I just take a punch and knock all the seals. There's 3 seals, one on the input and one on each of the outputs. These ones were kind of a pain in the butt. They were been in there for 50 years, I think. With everything completely apart, I did leave the caged roller bearings on that input, but everything else is out, cleaned up. I wash it off, use some brake cleaner, blow all the galleys out, blow everything out with air, make sure it's really nice and dry. Once I have it clean enough, this one's obviously been painted before, I'll throw it down and add a little bit of paint. And I always paint it with the aluminum so it looks nice. After the paint's dry and I'm set up ready to put this back together, I put the detent and the spring in because I don't want to lose them, and then I just put the retaining nut in a little bit because I don't want the detent to fully lock into the shifter yet. This is an optional piece to remove. I usually do to reseal it. This one still has silicone splurging out the holes, so I think we're okay there. So at this point, no need to remove it. Doing these after the first one, you will pull this out with the collar on it, and the 120 needle bearings won't fall out. But as I'm disassembling it, I'm looking for a problem. So I figure I can always reassemble those, and it's a good idea to inspect them anyway. So we'll start with assembling our main shaft here. I just set the shaft in the planetary drum. It gives me a good place to assemble it. I'm going to put some grease on here and then just start stacking needle bearings. You can use a bearing grease, but you just want to make sure it's something that'll dissolve in the transmission oil, and this will. You can also use Vaseline petroleum jelly. That works pretty good. This grease is cold. It sat outside last night, so it being thick will hold the bearings on pretty good. Also, I want to make a note. You can see that thrust washer flopping around in there. That's where this thrust washer goes, so make sure it's on there before you assemble the needle bearings. There's 3 different bearing race separators. Make sure you put those on. I start with the bottom one, and then I'm going to start putting some bearings on. After all the first row of bearings are on, then I'll put that second piece on, and then the third. After all the needle bearings are on, you can take this sliding gear and carefully slide it over the needle bearings. Make sure you have it correct side up. If you don't, you'll have to take it back off and flip it over, which isn't a big deal, but the fewer times you have to take this off, the better. You run the risk of losing a needle bearing. You can actually assemble the gear and the thrust washer on top of it. And here, remember, there's a thrust washer below it. So making sure it's in the correct position before the rest of it goes together, you're way better off. I wanted to kind of just take note. You can see this old one versus this replacement high range and low range shifter I got. The old one has the plastic bushing in it, and the new one is all metal. Should hold up a whole lot better over time. So even though I'm swapping these planetary innards because I got a better tooth pad in there, don't forget there are brass thrusts on both sides plus the brass oil bushing. Got a new shift fork, but I think there's a problem here. It looks like it's backwards. I have the correct one on the way. Starting the assembly, now I did not remove those inner bearings because there's nothing wrong with them, but there's a thrust washer and these thrust bearings. Now you can put them on with just a little bit of oil, or you can put some grease on them to hold them in place. Usually I'll use grease, especially on this one on the inner piece of the drive, just because this has to stay there after you put the planetary gear on, and then you feed the main shaft into it. So sometimes these are a little tricky too, because there's 3 different gears that have to line up before they'll actually drop in place.
These are
so after wiggling it around a little bit and getting everything lined up, it'll drop right in. I wanted to point something out here. The original has the plastic bushing, and it had this washer with a snap ring. The new one is an all metal collar. You do not put this back in or it'll jam it up. Now I did have to pull the planetary and range assembly out because the correct shifter showed up. So I put the shift fork on and then started dropping it all back down. Now everything lined up once, so I knew everything would fit well. It was a little easier to drop it all in this time. Now notice I don't have the guide rod in this, because dropping this in you'll have to line up the dowel into the shifter so it lines up correctly, and then you may have to move the shifter up and down or in and out to line up the rod. It lines up really easy. Remember, don't force anything on these. You kind of have to move stuff around, wiggle it around a little bit, and it'll literally just drop right in. Continuing on, don't forget the spring in here, and if it doesn't shift right, think about flipping stuff over, because I put these together backwards about 3 times every time I do one of these transfer cases before I remember or figure out what direction it goes. Then put our shift collar in our spring. Main cluster or main shaft, and make sure your bearing is still lined up. When you put this down, make sure this doesn't slide up too far, because those 120 needle bearings, you don't want to lose those. And we'll put our sprocket on. Now you can put the sprocket on with everything else. We've got a washer, and we've got our snap ring. Now snap rings have a cornered edge and one edge that feels a little smoother. On something like this, I'm holding these gears on, so I want that cornered edge coming up so that it has less of a chance to be rolled off under load. Make sure you get that seated in. Now everything should work just fine. So first thing I'm going to do is try to hold this enough to where I can go into neutral. Low range. Two, 4, neutral. I think we're good. Once the back half of the case is on and the chain's in, I'll double test this again to make sure I didn't miss something or I missed a wear pattern that could cause it to not go in or out of gear. Next, you put your chain on. You want to make sure you have a good chain. And same thing on the back snap ring. Make sure you read it. Make sure that edge is going up because it's retaining that sprocket on the rear. It'll be a little difficult there. Bingo. Before I glue all this together, I'm going to test fit it, make sure it fits correctly. On the rear sprocket, don't forget there's a thin thrust washer, your thrust bearing, and the thick washer that goes in here. So now that I'm in, I'm going to retest my shifter. Make sure I have all my gears where that's low. Neutral is always a pain in the butt on these because it's the high spot. There we go, neutral. Doesn't like to find neutral, so I'm probably going to have to take this back apart and figure out what's going on there. All right, you can see I'm back apart again. So I put the other half of the case on and I went through the gears again, and about half the time the neutral is not quite getting into neutral. It'll probably work okay in the vehicle with it spinning fast enough, but if it's not going into neutral and you think you're in neutral, you're probably going to do some damage at some point. So either the shifter actuator piece here or my dowel has enough wear in it that's causing that gear to drop, or just wear in the shift forks itself, even though this looks really good. I came up with a good solution though. I take this washer, it's only a 1/16 of an inch thick. I had to open it up a little bit and flatten one side just so it fits in my shifter like so. Now, when I slide this on and run the shifter, it's actually just a little bit higher. So now I'm going to reassemble this again, which I'd much rather reassemble it now than have to mess with it after it's in the vehicle and something's not working right. So testing it on the bench goes a long way. You can see this time I installed my gear at the same time, so just for perfect, smooth as glass. That won't stay there. So now I think I can do another full assembly and make sure everything's good and tight, and we'll be off to the races. Getting ready to put the back half of the case on. Don't forget about the thrust washer and the thrust bearing on your front output sprocket. Pay attention if there's a thick one and a thin one. On this one, the thin one goes to the case. Oil pump drive. Make sure that's on. And make sure it's seated all the way, otherwise the back half of your case won't go on. And you'll know that because this won't be even. Now they don't make gaskets just for this. Make sure you use the right adhesive. The black RVT silicone won't work. The blue won't work either because I've tried that and had to go back in and reseal a case. I don't care how neat it is initially because I'm going to run my finger over this and smooth it all out. Also, you don't need a ton of it. All you're doing is filling in minor gaps or flaws in the aluminum that aren't quite machined right. So it doesn't take a whole tube of gasket maker to seal a transfer case. And don't forget the magnet before you torque it down. These bolts don't take a whole bunch of torque. I think it's only about 20-25 pounds of torque, so I'll zip them in with an impact once I get them all started. They've already got some Loctite on them. These end bolts, I'll save that one, have a little bit fatter hole because they've got a dowel in them, so oil pump. I'll try to put it in backwards. It isn't going to work because it won't even fit. Fits in just fine like this. You can hold it in place, slide it on. If it's lined up, it'll usually stay where you need it to. Again, don't go overboard with your glue. There's a little bit of glue just down in there. Cleaned up the speedometer a little bit, but I wanted to point out something. You'll see numbers on the side of the speedometer housing. This one says 32 to 38. This gear has 33, so it's a 33 tooth. If you take those numbers and put them towards the speedometer gear, it'll slide right in. Otherwise, if you look at this, it's off center. What that'll do is it'll chew the gear up if you don't clock it correctly. Clocked correctly. Don't forget to put your detent ball and spring in as well. I leave them loose until I'm fully assembled. I'm sure you noticed I did not put the seals in when it was apart. Sometimes that is easier, I will agree. But there's kind of a reason I don't. First thing is, I did grease needle bearings and little thrust bearings and stuff as I went together. A little bit for lubrication, a lot of that just to hold it together. I don't like dipping everything in transmission fluid or transfer case fluid to assemble it, because you end up with dirt sticking to you. You have to take it apart. It eventually gets messy. You start getting messy, you start getting sloppy. I know everything in here went in clean, so now I'm going to run a few ounces of fluid down this bearing. Then I'm going to get a little bit on my finger, lube the inside of the seal lip. Now I'll tap the seal. Now that fluid's going to start draining through. Chances are it'll never get past or much past the sprockets, but it's going to get a lot of fluid on that shaft, and you can't use a seal driver to do that, but this is how I like doing it. Make sure you don't have a big groove. Make sure your surface is clean. You're in. The new seal kits come with these little rubber gaskets which go behind the nut as well. Now I'm going to flip it over and we'll put the seals in the other side. Same thing here. I'm going to start on this end because this end, it'll have to take a little bit to seep through those needle bearings. Now I did put some grease on those needle bearings and thrust bearings, so it isn't like they're not going to have any lubrication for the first rotation of the input shaft. That's the other thing. This will be full of fluid. It's only going to be a rotation or so, and everything in here will be covered in oil. But I definitely like having a little bit of oil in there in case someone forgets to fill it up when they do an initial start. That's the right one. Now these seal kits come with multiple seals, so don't think you're going to use everything, because this is a seal kit that's made for the Jeep, the Chevy version, the Dodge version. And before it leaves the shop, I'm going to do one more test. So I've got high range there. I've got 4 high. Neutral. And 4 low. Still don't like how those neutral work on that high spot. Yep. We're good to go. Well, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Going through a 208, I hope if any of you have 208s or very similar transfer cases that you have to go through, this might help you out. They aren't super hard. The hardest part about them is the 120 needle bearings that fall out when you pull them apart. My other suggestion is you can get all the schematics and parts lists right off of the internet and just print them. I always like doing that. Can save your butt. It doesn't matter how many times you've been through them. It's really easy to get something backwards, but test them on the bench. It'll save you a lot of time in pulling them, draining them, fixing them, putting them back in, all that stuff. Perfect example is that neutral washer I built for this one. This one should be good for another 100,000 or so miles. So we'll see you next time.